American author and wordsmith Mark Twain gave the Gilded Age its nickname, after describing how the era's golden gleam of the gilded surface hides the cheapness of the metal underneath. The rotting underbelly of the age would eventually give way to the Progressive Era, during which political reformers focused on four main goals: cleaning up politics, limiting the power of big business, reducing poverty, and promoting social justice. Each were sorely needed after the 6 men who served as the chief executive during the latter half of the 19th century, a period best described by breaking down the word politics by pointing out that poly means many, while ticks are blood-sucking animals. You're listening to a Push Through History, a resource designed for students completing the course of APUSH History. This episode covers the second subject of Period 6, 1865 to 1898, Politics in the Gilded Era. Ulysses S. Grant assumed the presidency in 1869, riding a wave of popularity as the Union's victorious general in the Civil War. His presidency began with noble intentions as he sought to continue the reconstruction of the fractured nation while ensuring that the newly freed African Americans enjoyed the rights granted to them under the newly amended Constitution. However, his time in office quickly became overshadowed by constant scandals, tarnishing his legacy. One of Grant's most commendable achievements was his aggressive action against the KKK, which had emerged in the South to terrorize black citizens in an effort to ensure that they never exercised their right to vote. He vigorously implemented the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, legislation that became commonly known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts. In his war with the Klan, Grant empowered federal district attorneys to prosecute suspected white supremacists, sent federal troops to suppress their violence, and worked to ensure that sympathizers were excluded from jury selections through the suspension of habeas corpus. Although its toxic ideology remained, by the mid-1870s the organization had largely disbanded. President Grant also created the Department of Justice, a move that strengthened federal authority in enforcing civil rights laws. Despite his success in combating racial violence, Grant's administration became synonymous with corruption. While he was described as personally honest and loyal, his inability to recognize and control the misconduct of those around him resulted in a scandal-filled 2 terms as president. The first of many unscrupulous endeavors that became attached to the former general's name became known as the Gold Scandal. 2 financiers attempted to corner the gold market by manipulating the government's issuance of reserves in order to panic private holders to sell, allowing the manipulators to purchase it up at a cheap price before then using the government to restore the natural equilibrium. The scheme was uncovered, though, and the president countered it by releasing gold reserves. While it stopped the plot, it triggered a market collapse, ruining quite a few investors who had borrowed money to buy gold at inflated prices. Grant's own brother-in-law was one of the many who were caught up in the so-called gold ring. In 1872, the Credit Mobilier scandal reared its ugly head. This scandal came about after it was discovered that executives of the Union Pacific Railroad created a fake construction company named Credit Mobilier. Their goal was to inflate costs and embezzle government funds. To cover up the scheme, they bribed members of Congress as well as the vice president with discounted stocks. Despite the fact that Grant was never implicated in the crime, and that he dropped his sitting vice president in favor of another running mate, the president paid a steep political price as public distrust of the government became widespread. 3 years later, a network of whiskey distillers and government officials conspired to defraud the federal government by avoiding tax payments on liquor, particularly whiskey. The scheme, which cost the Treasury an estimated $3 million annually, was inadvertently exposed by Grant's own Secretary of the Treasury. The president, initially hesitant to believe the accusations, ultimately ordered the prosecution of those involved. However, his efforts to shield his private secretary, who was also implicated, made the public skeptical that Grant's hands were clean. Then, in 1876, Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap, was caught accepting bribes in exchange for lucrative trading posts in Native American territories. Facing congressional impeachment, the secretary resigned, but the stench of scandal remained permanently attached to Grant. It didn't help that the president seemed to invite special interest groups. While lobbying existed before Grant, it was during his administration that the term became widely recognized. The legend goes that Grant, who often visited the Willard Hotel for an evening drink, would be approached by businessmen and political operatives in the hotel's lobby, seeking to have a word in order to influence the president's decisions. Although the story may be more myth than fact, Grant's presidency certainly saw an increase in corporate and special interest influence over government decisions. The rise of railroad tycoons, industrialists, and financiers seeking government contracts and subsidies contributed to a political climate where money and power were increasingly intertwined, creating a golden gleam on the surface. Rather than James Monroe's era of good feelings, Grant presided over the era of good stealings. Grant was replaced by Rutherford B. Hayes, whose electoral victory was challenged by his Democratic opponent, Samuel Tilden. The Compromise of 1877 kept the Republicans in the White House, but evicted the federal troops from the yet-to-be reconstructed South. He inherited a nation grappling with the excesses of the Gilded Age, and his administration sought to restore integrity to government, address economic challenges, and navigate tensions between labor and industry. Unfortunately, he struggled regarding each of these hefty challenges. Hayes inherited an economy that was still reeling from the Panic of 1873, the latest in a 20-year boom-bust cycle that had resulted in widespread bank failures, sky-high unemployment, and a prolonged economic depression. Many Americans, particularly farmers and debtors in the West and South, demanded inflationary policies to ease their financial burdens. Eventually, their plight would give rise to the Populist Party, one of the most successful third-party movements in American history. They advocated for the government to permanently eliminate the gold standard in favor of continued use of greenbacks, paper currency that had been issued during the Civil War. Hayes opposed such measures and worked to implement the Resumption Act, which mandated the redemption of greenbacks in gold. Despite initial opposition, the return to gold-backed currency helped to stabilize the economy and restore confidence in the financial system. His veto of an act which introduced the free coinage of silver, or bimetallism, however, set the stage for future monetary debates as the Western farmers came to recognize that neither of the two political parties were being responsive to their needs. The Gilded Age was notorious for political corruption, particularly the spoils system, which distributed government jobs based upon political loyalty rather than merit. Hayes made civil service reform one of his central goals, attempting to curtail the power of party bosses and political machines, such as Boss Tweed's Democratic operation in New York, known as Tammany Hall. Hayes, a Republican, first targeted his own party's organizational wing, the New York Custom House. His efforts to wrest control of the patronage system divided the Republicans into stalwarts and half-breeds. The president also issued an executive order which prohibited federal employees from being required to make campaign contributions, a common practice that had reinforced the patronage system. His efforts laid the groundwork for the eventual passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. That law, however, had the unintended consequences of opening up politics to business interests, as large corporate donations began to offset the loss of funds drawn down from federal employees. Throughout his presidency, Hayes sided with big business when they were in conflict with labor. The first major nationwide labor strike in American history, an event known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, occurred on his watch. In response to wage cuts during an economic downturn, workers shut down rail lines and engaged in violent clashes with law enforcement. Local authorities struggled to control the unrest, and state militias refused to fire on strikers, despite orders handed down to do exactly that. Hayes used his office to deploy federal troops to break the strike, resulting in dozens of workers paying the ultimate price for their desire to make a living wage. 3 years into his first term, Hayes announced that he wouldn't seek a second one, allowing him to focus on governance without the distraction of partisan campaigning. One-term limits would become yet another policy that emerged on the wish list of the populist Third Party. In reality, Hayes knew that his premature ending of Reconstruction had alienated both the radical Republicans and African Americans, the two core groups that made up the base of the party of Lincoln. His decision did allow the Republicans to hold on to the presidency, as James Garfield took over the mantle of the chief executive. He was a compromise candidate who emerged above the fracas at the highly contested 1880 Republican National Convention, a party who had split into groups known as the Stalwarts and the Half-Breeds. Just months into Garfield's presidency, however, Charles Goutier, a deranged office seeker with strong ties to the Stalwarts, shot the president in the back while he was going to board a passenger train. The assassin was promptly arrested, while Garfield told onlookers, "I don't think this is serious. I will live." He did just that, surviving for another 11 months before succumbing to complications from the gunshot wound. Following the assassination, just the second in the nation's history, Vice President Chester A. Arthur ascended to the nation's highest office. He was assumed to be a typical product of the spoils system, an insider aligned with the stalwart faction who had risen up through the New York Custom House, a political machine that regularly wrestled with Tammany Hall for control of New York City. The stalwarts believed in rewarding political loyalty with government jobs, a system that had long been the backbone of political machines across the country. In contrast, their opponents, known as the half-breeds, argued for a more merit-based approach to civil service appointments, a reform that would eventually undermine the entrenched patronage networks. However, in a stunning reversal of expectations, Arthur embraced civil service reform. His support for the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act marked a turning point in American history by establishing a merit-based system for government employment, significantly limiting the influence of the political machines and laying the groundwork for a modern professional civil service that prioritized competence over loyalty. Despite decent reviews, Arthur declined to run for president in 1884, fading into the background so that the party could look for a candidate who could better unite the two warring factions. His decision resulted in one of the most vile campaigns in American history. The Democrats nominated New York Governor Grover Cleveland, a man who had built up a public reputation as a reformer of integrity. The Republicans nominated James Blaine, a prominent politician who had served as a congressman, senator, and as Secretary of State. As was fitting for the Gilded Age, their gleaming reputations didn't hold up upon close scrutiny. Both sides engaged in negative campaigning, with it coming out that Cleveland had fathered a child out of wedlock, resulting in the chant, "Ma, ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." His party was also derogatorily referred to as the party of the three R's: rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Rum to invoke associations of vice and corruption. Romanism to label their Catholic immigrant allies as un-American and morally compromised. And rebellion to remind voters of the Democratic Party's lasting connection to the Civil War. The Republicans would have won easily if they had run a squeaky clean candidate such as Chester A. Arthur. Instead, they ran a lifetime politician who had earned the nickname Slippery Jim. A group of documents emerged that became known collectively as the Mulligan Letters, which hinted at alleged corruption with foreign officials. Both sides dragged each other deeper into the muck, relying upon personal attacks rather than policy debates. This negatively set an unfortunate precedent for future presidential elections where personal character and moral conduct become central themes, and the use of incendiary rhetoric to sway public opinion, often by invoking deep-seated social prejudices, remains a tactic in American politics. Grover Cleveland emerged victorious, the first Democratic president since the Civil War, breaking the Republicans' hold on the nation's highest office for the previous 24 years. His unwavering commitment to laissez-faire economics and limited government intervention set a high standard for fiscal conservatism and administrative integrity. On the other hand, his reluctance to engage with the rising tide of labor and economic inequality highlighted the limitations of a purely hands-off approach during a period of rapid industrial change. The new president used his veto power extensively to prevent the passage of any bill which was viewed as either wasteful or designed to benefit special interests, arguing that the federal government should not prop up failing businesses or meddle in local affairs. When the economy experienced a downturn, he reportedly said that although the people support the federal government should not support the people. This steadfast commitment to minimal intervention meant that many of the era's pressing economic interests were addressed by market forces rather than by sweeping government reforms. The president was also noticeably reluctant to intervene on behalf of labor. Emphasizing the sanctity of contracts and private enterprise, Cleveland often viewed labor disputes as matters best resolved between employers and employees. His hands-off stance meant that when strikes and labor unrest occurred, his government was slow to offer meaningful support or mediation. This approach left many workers unprotected and contributed to a growing sense of alienation among the laboring class. He lost his re-election bid to Benjamin Harrison, a man whose tireless efforts to earn votes became known as front porch campaigning. In a world that was increasingly becoming defined by fights between labor and ownership, Cleveland's policies managed to alienate him from both sides. Labor unions and the working class hated him for his lack of intervention, while businesses lamented his lack of protectionist tariffs. Benjamin Harrison became the 23rd President of the United States after defeating Democrat Grover Cleveland. Harrison emerged victorious after a series of small gatherings and invitations to key stakeholders to his own personal residence. This strategy allowed him to present himself as a steady, reliable leader. His administration laid the groundwork for what would later be known as the New Navy, as he came to recognize the strategic necessity of a modern steel-hulled fleet. As the calendar turned to the 20th century, it would make the difference in the nation's quest to become an imperial power, as the expansion was not merely a military upgrade, it was also a statement of national ambition. The man that would set the United States on an imperial course was William McKinley. His use of the Navy that Harrison built, as well as the fact that it was President Harrison who signed the 1890 McKinley Tariff Act, would tie the men together on pages of history. The tariff was designed to raise the money necessary to ensure that the government could pay 100% of the promised pensions of its Civil War veterans. While it was popular with manufacturers and industrialists, the record-high peacetime tariffs raised prices for ordinary people, crowding out the middle class at the precise time that consumer cultures and a national identity that favored leisure over work had begun to emerge. Harrison's time in office also saw him sign the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, a law which would be used by Teddy Roosevelt to break up the monopolistic trusts that had come to dominate the Gilded Age. He also oversaw the admission of 6 new states, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming, introducing these farm-heavy western states into the Electoral College, a result that would bring the populace to the precipice of power. It also meant that Harrison had unwittingly ruined his chances at being a 2-term president. By the early 1890s, many Americans, particularly those in rural areas and among small business owners, were reeling beneath the burden of high tariffs and economic policies that favored industrialists. The McKinley Tariff in particular had raised prices on imported goods, which hurt consumers and spurred growing resentment among farmers and working-class voters. The Democrats once again ran Grover Cleveland, who campaigned on a platform of restoring fiscal responsibility and reducing unnecessary government intervention and high tariffs. His message of returning to a smaller but more principled, straightforward government struck a chord with voters who had become disillusioned by political opportunism. He narrowly won, making him the first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. While his approach to government remained the same, the Panic of 1893 introduced markedly different circumstances that he had to deal with. The collapse of several major banks and railroad companies was deep and prolonged, challenging Cleveland's belief in laissez-faire economic policies, which just let it be. His handling of the Depression alienated many who felt that his adherence to gold standard policies and a reluctance to intervene worsened the economic situation. Rather than appeasing the populist wing of the Democratic Party, he doubled down on the gold standard, repealing the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, which had required the U.S. government to purchase silver and mint it into coins, something that many saw as a potential remedy for the nation's economic troubles. Cleveland's second term would prove to be his last, as the populist faction of the Democratic Party had managed to wrest control and nominate the up-and-coming William Jennings Bryan, a Nebraskan lawyer with a golden tongue. Popularism is a political approach that tries to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are being disregarded by established elites. In this era, the Democrats largely focused upon the South and a handful of key cities, while the Republicans dominated via their support of the industrial areas, particularly the Midwest and Northeast. Farmers to the west of the Mississippi, however, felt completely alone, particularly after the Panic of 1893 and the McKinley Tariff, which had saddled them with debts that had become impossible to get out from under. Farmers don't have the ability to work their way out of trouble. In times like these, growing more crops oversaturated the market, which would decrease prices of their products. It may seem odd, but in order to increase the prices of their crops, these farmers hoped for inflation to rise. If there were more money in circulation, people would buy more food and therefore bring prices back up to a sustainable level. The populist movement became a major third-party influence, a fact that becomes clear when one realizes that they achieved almost all of their political priorities. The fact that they did so without ever actually winning the presidency makes it even more remarkable. Here's what they managed to achieve: a graduated income tax, government ownership of utilities, direct election of senators, a shorter workday, and restrictions on immigration. They partially achieved presidential term limits, as it became 2 after World War II, while they had sought a 1-term limit, as well as the adoption of the processes known as the initiative and referendum, both of which originated in Wisconsin and have spread to all of the other states. The only priority that they didn't manage to achieve was the unlimited coinage of silver. However, the US eventually backed off of the gold standard, making bimetallism unnecessary. Bryan achieved the Democratic nomination for president on the back of his Cross of Gold speech, which used religious language to evoke an America where the poor, both rural and urban, had been crucified upon a cross of gold. He ultimately lost the last election of the Gilded Age because of a lack of Democratic enthusiasm in the South. The populists, in an effort to dominate the South, had clashed with the Dixiecrats by encouraging Southern African Americans to abandon the Republican Party and consider voting directly for populists. This outreach to an ignored group in the South was a classic populist move, but it alienated Southern whites, proving that racial hatred trumped economic messages. Jennings also lost because he relied upon small donations from working-class people who had little to give. William McKinley, the Republican nominee, courted corporate interests, raising $16 million to Jennings' $1 million that he spent, showcasing that business interests trumped the will of the people. The 1896 election began the urban-rural divide that still exists today, bringing McKinley to power and making Grover Cleveland the first Democrat elected since Lincoln and the last one until Woodrow Wilson. Like his Republican predecessor Benjamin Harrison, McKinley ran a front porch campaign, remaining at home to speak with large groups of visitors. Once in office, McKinley doubled down on the gold standard, instilling predictability and clarity to the economy. After gold was discovered in Alaska, a territory that America had purchased in 1850, the issue of bimetallism was irrelevant, as the government was now allowed to increase the amount of dollars in circulation, restoring crop prices to an acceptable level. McKinley doubled down on tariffs as a means of protecting American industries, signing the Dingley Tariff Act, which raised taxes on imported goods to historically high levels, in some cases as much as 48%. The goal of the policy was to shield American businesses from foreign competition, especially industries like steel, textiles, and agriculture. McKinley also took major steps in the realms of foreign policy, but those maneuvers, which began the process of seeking an imperial empire, begins the next period for study. I'll end this podcast with a look at the South during the Gilded Age. Henry Grady, a newspaper editor in Atlanta, declared the existence of a new South. In this new era, Grady claimed that the South had accepted its loss in the Civil War, rejected racism in favor of the acceptance of diversity, and developed a love for work and industry. As evidence of the change, he pointed out that the South had passed the North in the production of textiles, laid the most railroad tracks down, and established elite urban areas such as Atlanta, Birmingham, Greensboro, and Charlotte. Scratch the surface a little bit, and one unfortunately discovers the rotten underbelly. Sharecropping and convict lease programs had reinstated slavery beneath a different name, while African Americans were dealing with a constant rollback of their rights, particularly their ability to sit on a jury. The Supreme Court didn't help, narrowing the 14th Amendment to allow for private discrimination and creating the separate but equal doctrine through the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which had been a planned challenge to showcase the exact opposite. The increase in vigilantism, which was courageously documented by Ida B. Wells, revealed that the Jim Crow South was bypassing the justice system in order to terrorize African Americans. The existence of the New South was merely a mirage. Just another part of the Gilded Age that proved to be fool's gold.